Welcome back to Elven Heights. Let's carry on reading Star Wars Darth Bane Path of Destruction. Chapter 1. Dessel was lost in the suffering of his job, barely even aware of his surroundings. His arms ached from the endless pounding of the hydraulic jack. Small bits of rock skipped off the cavern wall as he bored through, ricocheting off his protective goggles and stinging his exposed face and hands. Clouds of atomized dust filled the air, obscuring his vision, and the screeching whine of the jack filled the cavern, drowning out all other sounds as it burrowed centimeter by agonizing centimeter into the thick vein of cortosis woven into the rock before him. Impervious to both heat and energy, cortosis was prized in the construction of armor and shielding by both commercial and military interests, especially with the galaxy at war. Highly resistant to blaster bolts, cortosis alloys supposedly could withstand even the blade of a lightsaber. Unfortunately, the very properties that made it so valuable also made it extremely difficult to mine. Plasma torches were virtually useless. It would take days to burn away even a small section of the cortosis-laced rock. The only effective way to mine it was through the brute force of hydraulic jacks, pounding it relentlessly away at the vein, chipping the cortosis free bit by bit. Cortosis is one of the hardest materials in the galaxy. The force of the pounding quickly wore down the head of a jack, blunting it until it became almost useless. The dust clogged the hydraulic pistons, making them jam. Mining cortosis was hard on the equipment, and even harder on the miners. Des had been hammering away for nearly 6 standard hours. The jack weighed more than 30 kilos, and the strain of keeping it raised and pressed against the rock face was taking its toll. His arms were trembling with the extortion, his lungs were gasping for air and choking on the clouds of the fine mineral dust thrown up from the jack's head. Even his teeth hurt. The rattling vibration felt as if it were shaking them loose from his gums. But the miners on Apatros were paid based on how much cortosis they brought back. If he quit now, another miner would jump in and start working the vein, taking a share of the profits. Des didn't like to share. The whine of the jack's motor took on a higher pitch. The whine. The whine of the jack's motor took on a higher pitch, becoming a keening wail Des was all too familiar with. At 20,000 RPM, the motor sucked in dust like a thirsty bantha sucking up water after a long desert crossing. The only way to combat it was to regular cleaning and servicing, and the Outer Rim Ore Works Company preferred to buy cheap equipment and replace it rather than sinking credits into maintenance. Des knew exactly what was going to happen next, and a second later, it did. The motor blew. The hydraulic seized, and with a horrible crunch and a cloud of black smoke spit out the rear of the jack, cursing ORO and its corporate policies, Des released his cramped finger from the trigger and tossed a spent piece of equipment to the floor. "Move aside, kid," a voice said. Gerd, one of the other miners, stepped up and tried to shoulder Des out of the way so he could work the vein with his own jack. Gerd had been working the mines for nearly 20 standard years and had been turned his body into a mass of hard, knotted muscle. But Des had not worked the mines for 10 years himself, ever since he was a teenager, and he was tall as the older man, and a little bigger. He didn't budge. "I'm not done here," he said. "Jack died, that's all. Hand me yours and I'll keep at it for a while. You know the rules, kid. You stop working and someone else allowed to move in." Technically, Gerd was right, but nobody ever jumped another miner's claim over an equipment malfunction, not unless he was trying to pick a fight. Des took a quick look around. The chamber is empty except for the two of them, standing less than half a meter apart. Not a surprise. Des usually chose caverns far off the main tunnel network. It had to be more than mere coincidence that Gerd was here. Des had known Gerd for as long as he could remember. The middle-aged man had been friends with Hurst, Des's father. Back when Des first started working the mines at 13, he had taken a lot of abuse from the bigger miners. His father had been the worst tormentor, but Gerd had been one of the main instigators, dishing out more than his fair share of teasing, insults, and the occasional cuff on the ear. The harassments had had ended shortly after Dess's father died of a massive heart attack. It wasn't because of the miners. If it wasn't the miners. What the heck? If it wasn't because the miners felt sorry for the orphaned young man, though. It wasn't because the miners felt sorry for the orphaned young man, though. By the time Hearst died, the tall, skinny teenager they loved to bully had become a mountain of muscle and heavy hands and a fierce temper. Mining was a tough job. It was the closest thing to hard labor outside a public prison colony. Whoever worked the mines on Apatros got big, and Des has just happened to become the biggest of them all. Half a dozen black eyes, countless bloody noses, and one broken jaw in the space of a mouth was all it took for Hearst's old friends to decide they'd be happier if they'd left Des alone. Yet it was almost as if they blamed him for Hearst's death. And every few months, one of them tried again. Gert had always been smart enough to keep his distance until now. "I don't see any of your friends here with you, old man," Des said. "So back off my claim, and nobody gets hurt." Gert spat on the ground at Des's feet. "You don't even know what day it is, do you, boy? Crippling disgrace is what you are." They were standing close enough to each other that Des could smell the sour Carillion whiskey on Gert's breath. The man was drunk. Drunk enough to come looking for a fight, but still sober enough to hold his own. 5 years ago today," Gert said, shaking his head sadly. 5 years ago today, your own father died, and you don't even remember." Des rarely even thought about his father anymore. He had been sorry to see him go. His earliest memories were of his father smacking him. He didn't even remember the reason. Hearst rarely needed one. "Can't say I miss Hearst the same way you do, Gerd." "Hearst?" Gerd snorted. He raised you by himself after your mother died, and you don't even have the respect to call him Dad? You ungrateful son of a calf hound." Des glared down menacingly at Gerd, but the shorter man was too full of drink and self-righteous indignation to be intimidated. "Should have expected this from a mud-crutch whelp like you," Gerd continued. "Hearst always said you were no good. He knew there was something wrong with you." "Bane!" Des narrowed his eyes, but didn't rise to the bait. Hearst had called him by that name when he was drunk. Bane. He had blamed his son for his wife's death, blamed him for being stuck on Apatros. He considered his only child to be the bane of his existence, a fact he tended to spit out at Des in his drunken rages. Bane. It represented everything spiteful, petty, and mean about his father. It struck at the innermost fears of every child: fear of disappointment, fear of abandonment, fear of violence. As a kid, that name had hurt more than all the smacks from his father's heavy fist. But Des wasn't a kid anymore. Over time, he learned to ignore it, along with all the rest of the hateful bile that spilled from his father's mouth. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. "I've got work to do." With one hand, he grabbed the hydraulic jack from Gerd's grasp. He put the other hand on Gerd's shoulder and shoved him away. Stumbling back, the inebriated man caught his heel on a rock, fell roughly to the ground. He stood up with a snarl, his hands bulging into fists. "Guess your daddy's been gone too long, boy. You need someone to beat the sense back into you." Gerd was drunk, but he was no fool, Des realized. Des was bigger, stronger, younger, but he spent the last 6 years working hydraulic jack. He was covered in grime, and the sweat was dripping off his face. His shirt was drenched. Gerd's uniform, on the other hand, was still relatively clean. No dust, no sweat stains. He must have been planning this all day, taking it easy, sitting back while Des wore himself out. But Des wasn't about to back down from a fight. Throwing Gerd's jack to the ground, he dropped into a crouch, feet wide, arms held out in front of him. Gerd charged forward, swinging his right fist in a vicious uppercut. Des reached out and caught the punch with the open palm of his left hand, absorbing the force of the blow. His right hand snapped forward, grabbed the underside of Gerd's right wrist as he pulled the older man forward. Des ducked down and turned, driving his shoulder into Gerd's chest, using his opponent's own momentum against him. Des strained up and yanked hard on Gerd's wrist, flipping him up and over so that he crashed to the ground on his back. The fight should have ended right then. Des had a split second before he could have dropped his knee onto his opponent, driving the breath from his lungs and pinning him to the ground while he pounded Gerd with his fists. But it didn't happen. His back, exhausted from hours of hefting the 30-kilo jack, spasmed. The pain was agonizing. Instinctively, Des strained up, clutching at the knotted lumbar muscles. It gave Gerd a chance to roll out of the way and get back to his feet. Somehow Des managed to drop into his fighting crouch again. His back howled in protest, and he grimaced as red-hot daggers of pain shot through his body. Gerd saw the grimace and laughed. "Cramping up there, boy? You should know better than to try and fight after a 6-hour shift in the mines." Gerd charged forward again. This time his hands were fists, but claws grasping and grabbing at anything they could find, trying to nullify the younger man's height and reach by getting in close. Des tried to scramble out of the way, but his legs were too stiff and sore to get him clear. One hand grabbed his shirt, the other got hold of his belt as Gerd pulled both of them to the ground. They grappled together, wrestling on the hard, uneven stone of the cavern floor. Gerd had his face buried against Dessel's chest to protect it, keeping Des from landing a solid elbow or headbutt. He still had a grip on Des's belt, but now his other hand was free and punching blindly up to where he guessed Des's face would be. Des was forced to wrap his arms in and around Gerd's own, interlocking them so neither man could throw a punch. With their limbs pinned, strategy and technique meant little. The fight had become a test of strength and endurance, with the two combatants slowly wearing each other down. Dessel tried to roll Gerd over onto his back, but his weary body betrayed him. His limbs were heavy and soft. He couldn't get the leverage he needed. Instead, it was Gerd who was able to twist and turn, wrenching one of his hands free while still keeping his face pressed against Des's chest so it wouldn't be exposed. Des wasn't so lucky. His face was open and vulnerable. Gerd struck a blow with his free hand, but he hadn't hit with a closed fist. Instead, he drove his thumb hard into Des's cheek, only a few centimeters from his real target. He struck again with the thumb, looking to gouge out one of his opponent's eyes and leave him blind and writhing in pain. It took Des a second to realize what was happening. His tired mind had become as slow and clumsy as his body. He turned his face away just as the second blow landed, the thumb jamming painfully into the cartilage of his upper ear. Dark rage exploded inside Des, a burst of fiery passion that burned away the exhaustion and fatigue. Suddenly, his mind was clear. His body felt strong and rejuvenated. He knew what he was going to do next. More importantly, he knew with absolute certainty what Gerd would do next too. He couldn't explain how he knew. Sometimes he could just anticipate an opponent's next move. Instincts, some might have said. Des felt it was something more. It was too detailed, too specific to be simple instinct. It was more like a vision, a brief glimpse into the future, and whenever it happened, Des always knew what to do, as if something was guiding and directing his actions. When the next blow came, Des was more than ready for it. He could picture it perfectly in his mind. He knew exactly when it was coming and precisely where it would strike. This time he turned his head to the opposite direction, exposing his face to the incoming blow, and opened his mouth. He bit down hard, his timing perfect, and his teeth sank deep into the dirty flesh of the Gerd's probing thumb. I'm sorry, I'll read that again. He bit down hard, his time perfect, and his teeth sank down into the dirty flesh of Gerd's probing thumb. Gerd screamed as Des clamped his jaw shut, severing the tendon and striking bone. He wondered if he could bite clean through, and then, as if the very thought made it happen, he severed Gerd's thumb. The screams became shrieks as Gerd released his grasp and rolled away, clasping his maimed hand with his whole one. Crimson blood welled up through the fingers, trying to stanch the flow from his stump. Standing up slowly, Des spat the thumb out onto the ground. The taste of blood was hot in his mouth. His body felt strong and re-energized, as if some great power surged through his veins. All the fight had been taken out of his opponent. Des could do anything he wanted to Gerd now. The older man rolled back and forth on the floor, his hand clutched to his chest. He was moaning and sobbing, begging for mercy, pleading for help. Des shook his head in disgust. Gerd had brought this on himself. It had started as a simple fist fight. The loser could have ended up with a black eye and some bruises, but nothing more. Then the older man had taken things to another level by trying to blind him, and he'd responded in kind. Des had learned long ago not to escalate a fight unless he was willing to pay the price of losing. Now Gerd had learned that lesson too. Des had a temper, but he wasn't the kind to keep beating on a helpless opponent. Without looking back at his defeated foe, he left the cavern and headed back up to the tunnel to tell one of the four what had happened so someone could come and tend to Gerd's injury. He wasn't worried about the consequences. The medics could reattach Gerd's thumb, so at worst, Des would be fined a day or two's wages. The corporate didn't really care about what its employees did, as long as they kept coming back to mine the cortosis. Fights were common among the miners, and ORO almost always turned a blind eye. Though this particular fight had been more vicious than most, savage and short, with a brutal end, just like life on Apatros. Wow. Alright, that's the end of chapter 1. See you next time for chapter 2. See you later, elves.